Okay, let's make a list of some of the transformations we see here. This plus 4 is on the inside of the function. And when something is on the inside of the function, that means that it's going to shift the function either left or right. Now, when it's inside the function, remember, it's the opposite of what you might think it is. So this function has been translated left 4 units. Now, this minus 2 is outside the function. And when something is outside the function, that means it affects the y values. Okay, so since this has been subtracted by 2, this means it's gone down 2 units. So this function has been transformed to the left 4 and down 2. Okay, so now here we have two more translations. This is inside the function, which means it's going to affect the x values. And x goes left and right. And since it's on the inside, it's the opposite of what your intuition says. So this is going right 5. Okay, the 1 is on the outside. And when it's on the outside, that means it affects the y values. And y goes up and down. So since it's plus 1, this has gone up 1. So this function has been transformed right 5 and up 1. Now let's take a look at this one. This negative means that we have a reflection. And the reflection is on the outside. And the outside means that it impacts the y values. Okay, so this has been reflected over the x axis. Now, I thought you said this affects the y values. Well, if we have a graph and I have a point, if I want to affect the y values, I'm going to move it down here. If this is the point xy, then this is the point x negative y. Okay, the y value is the only thing that changed, and this has been reflected over the x-axis. Okay. So this negative means it's reflected over the x-axis. This plus 2 is on the inside of the function, which means that it affects the x values. And remember, inside is opposite. So this has gone left 2. So this has two transformations, reflected over the x-axis and left 2. Now here we have two negatives. This negative here is on the outside, which impacts the y values. This x is on the inside, and that impacts the x values. So this one on the outside, since it impacts the x or the y values, that means, again, if I have a point and I affect the y values, that means I've reflected it over the x-axis. So this first one has been reflected over the x-axis. This second negative, that affects the x values. So again, if I have some point and I want to change the x's, I'm going to move it over here. So if I reflect this point over here, this is the point negative x, y. I've changed the x value. Well, which axis did it reflect over? The y. So if it affects the x's, that means it's been reflected over the y-axis. Okay. Now I have one more transformation here. I just have this +1, and that's on the outside. So since it's on the outside, it impacts the y values. So this has gone up 1. So we have 3 transformations. Reflected over x, reflected over y, and up 1. Okay, so this -2 represents 2 transformations. This negative is on the outside, which means this has been reflected over the x-axis. The 2, well, that corresponds to a vertical stretch of 2. And this 1 is on the outside, which affects the y values. And so this has gone up 1. Okay. Okay, so now here we have 2 more. This negative, that affects the x's. Okay. And if it affects the x's, that means it's a reflection over the y-axis. Now this 3, well, that's going to affect the x values. So if I have something that looks like this, okay, and I multiply it by 3, so recall that anything that happens on the inside is the opposite. So this actually corresponds to a horizontal shrink. Okay, I've taken this line here and I've shrunk it horizontally. Okay, so this is a horizontal shrink of 1/3. Okay, and those are the 2 transformations. Okay, so now let's take a look at some functions, some actual functions. Okay, this 2 is outside the square. Okay, so, well, first of all, let's look at the parent. The parent function is x squared. Again, like I said, this 2 is outside the square. So this is corresponding to up 2. It affects the y values because it's on the outside. This 3 is on the inside of the square. So, first of all, the parent, well, it's squared, so the parent is x squared. And the transformation, since this 3 is on the inside, that affects the x values. So that means this has gone left 3. Recall that the inside, the function, is the opposite of what your intuition might say. Okay, this negative and this 3 are outside the square. So again, the parent is x squared. This negative on the outside is a reflection over, right, the y, oops, the x axis. This 3 again is on the outside, so it's going to affect the y values. And if it affects the y values, that means it's a vertical stretch of 3. Okay, what's the parent here? The parent is the square root of x. This minus 2 is on the inside of the square root. That means that it is going to affect the x's. And remember, inside is opposite of your intuition. So this corresponds to right 2. Okay, here we have a reflection. And this is either up, down, or left, or right. Well, which one is it? Well, it's outside the square root, which means it's going to affect the y values. This negative is also outside the square root, so it will affect the y values. So the parent is the square root of x. This negative is a reflection over the, see, you're going to make mistakes about these. A reflection over the x-axis. The minus 3 means it's gone down 3. Okay, what's the parent function here? The parent is the absolute value of x. This plus 2 is on the inside, and the inside is the opposite of your intuition. So this corresponds to left 2. The minus 1 is outside, and that corresponds to up and down. So this is down 1. Okay, the parent function here, again, is the absolute value of x. All of these transformations are outside the function. This is outside the absolute value, this is outside the absolute value, and this is outside the absolute value. So the minus on the outside corresponds to a reflection over the x-axis. The 4 on the outside corresponds to a vertical stretch of 4. And the minus 3 corresponds to a down 3. And that's all I have for you. Thanks for watching.